Hi there, welcome to PCI Compliance Demystified. I'm Lee Latham, I'm the technical trainer here at cPanel, and I'll be your guide today as we talk about this fun and interesting subject. Today we're going to be talking about two major areas. First, general definitions of PCI DSS. Basically that's the data security standard. And also how to pass a scan on your cPanel server. PCI compliance is a very large subject. We can't really cover everything in here. We're really going to be focusing on general concepts and how to pass a scan on your cPanel server. First, a little history about myself. Again, my name is Lee Latham. I've been a computer geek since 1981. I've been a Linux geek since about 1994. I spent 10 years at a little software company called Larson Software Technology, where I did everything other than coding. And I left that company in 2006 to make my own video game, which I'm still working on. I have been here at cPanel, started as a technical analyst in May of 2008, and lately I've become the technical trainer. So, let's get on with it. First, what is PCI compliance? Basically, that is the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. You'll see PCI DSS sometimes. Essentially, all that is a standard required for servers which will access credit card data. So, what is it? You tell that to people sometimes, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. So, what it is really is a minimum standard of security best practices. Basically, a list of practices that are known to lead to trouble. Now, of course, security people call that enumerating badness, and it's not a complete security strategy. It's basically one aspect of your total system security strategy, but in the end, it's just so you can run credit cards. So, what PCI compliance isn't a guarantee that your server is secure. It isn't that. A checklist to make your server unhackable. Definitely not that. A substitute for competent system administration. It's not that either. Just to repeat that, PCI compliance does not make your server unhackable. It absolutely does not make your server unhackable. There is no substitute for vigilant system administration. The majority of exploits on your server are related to poorly written scripts, essentially. That's really the biggest vector you have to watch out for. PCI compliance just means that you can run credit cards on your server. So, a few common questions. How often do you need to scan? It depends on your financial institution and the amount of transactions you run. A lot of variables, a lot of leeway is given to the financial institutions to decide how often your machine needs to be scanned, how it needs to be scanned, whether occasionally you may even have a software that runs on the server, usually not, but it can happen. What happens if I'm non-compliant and I still run credit cards? All kinds of things can happen. Your financial institution may raise your rates or even prohibit you from running credit cards, but really that's up to them. So here we see a part of the standard, which I'm going to show you a URL to that shortly, that shows some specific rules for shared hosting servers. It can be very difficult to achieve the highest level of compliance on a shared hosting server, and that's way more than we can cover here in a little video or a talk. But you can see that there's some details there that really matter to shared hosting, in particular keeping users from seeing each other's data, which is very important. So you definitely want to check out this URL, PCISecurityStandards.org. That has all the information about PCI compliance, and you really should be aware of all of it. So, but we can help you to pass a scan. So, how does a PCI scan work? It's what we call a black box scan, meaning it's not on the server, but outside of it. All right? Just like an attacker. An attacker scans your server, looks for information on it, and uses that information to potentially exploit your server. So the scan is outside the server, attempts to glean what information it can, and then gives you information about it. So you'll typically get a really long list at first, and it can be a little intimidating. You'll find there's a few little tweaks that'll dramatically reduce the number. There's one flaw that can show a whole lot of potential vulnerabilities. And so we're definitely going to go through the most common ones here today. And I'm going to walk you through the process that I went through in securing my test server. We're going to be using the McAfee scanner. There's a free McAfee scan available from cpanel.net. There's the URL for it. And the McAfee scanner, the scans run every 24 hours. Typically, you can force one to run, but it can take a while to run. And that's one thing, is it's not something you can expect to do very quickly. You should expect it to take several days potentially to make your server PCI compliant, because it takes a long time for the scan to run, and you'll have to then fix the problems and let the scan run again. Even if you force it, it could take at least several hours for a new scan to run. So it's not something I can really do live for you. I'm going to kind of show you a whole lot of screenshots and some details there of how it works. So one thing you want to look for when you're in the McAfee scanner in particular is they have their own McAfee security certification, and that's a great thing too. But for PCI, you need to make sure you're looking at the PCI vulnerabilities report. That's the information you actually need to be looking at, and you could easily get confused about it. So be sure you're looking at that report. All right, first one we have here, website directory listing. That's interesting. You see it's on port 80 TCP. That basically is your main HTTPD port. And you can see it's a GET request, which means it's basically like typing a URL into a browser. All right. Now here it'll show you the URL fragment that you can use to see the problem. Here you see it's /manual/images. Basically, put http:// your host name and then that to see what the problem is. And if you take a look at that, or if you took a look at that on my server, you'd see this. And this is probably familiar to most of you. You see the index of manual images. So the reason this is bad is that it's just free information about the contents of the server that really isn't intended to be served out there. It could give access to include files that maybe weren't intended to be shown. Sometimes you'll see poorly designed scripts will have include files in the public directory with login information, such as databases. That's definitely not stuff you want to have out there. So by simply disabling indexes, you can take care of this problem. And the way you can do that is here in WHM. Go to Apache configuration, global configuration, and you'll see right there, indexes. Uncheck that. Hit save. It's done. Now, by the way, this one tweak right here will get rid of a lot of potential vulnerabilities, because that allows the scan to find more information. And that, just like an attacker can do, if you have indexes enabled, the attacker can automatically go through everything in there looking for certain things. So they could download every file, grep for password, things like that. Not good. The next thing we have is SSL version 2 protocol detection. And what's that? Now it's on port 443, that's your default SSL port. And you can see there, it talks about how SSL version 2 is known to have some vulnerabilities. So what does this mean? Well, basically when you're having a secure connection to your web server, there's a negotiation that goes on between the client and the server, and you choose what's called a cipher. And basically a cipher, the cipher names are names given by the mathematicians and programmers that build these services, so that system administrators and ordinary people like myself can easily handle them. So all you need to do is change that. Basically the server announces the protocols it supports, and that's how you do that. So again, go to Apache configuration, global configuration, and right there at the top, you'll see the cipher list. Now, we get a lot of support requests about that. It looks very intimidating, and it kind of is, but it's actually surprisingly straightforward. Basically, it's just a list of supported ciphers in the server. It kind of starts on the left and goes to the right, and you can make a list of preferences, essentially. And the order does matter. Basically, here you can see the default one is cPanel. We say, absolutely no ADH. That's anonymous Diffie-Hellman. Plus high means we prefer high strength encryption. Plus medium strength encryption is okay. Minus low, we don't want low strength encryption. And minus SSL v2, which of course is what the McAfee scan was complaining about. So here we're taking that out. And lastly, we're now export strength encryption, which is low strength encryption as well. So one little warning I want to give to you here, it's kind of intuitive or counterintuitive, I guess. If you have a new cPanel server and you've just built Apache with it, and you go to the screen, you kind of look at that and say, well, hey, I already have minus SSL v2 there. Well, there's a little thing there with cPanel. None of the settings in that GUI take effect until you save it the first time. When you first build Apache under cPanel, you're going with all the default values in Apache. But when you come in here, the first time you go in there and hit save, everything in that part of the GUI will become effective. So essentially all you have to do in here is just go in there and hit save. The default value is going to work for that particular potential vulnerability. Now, there's a lot to know about this. Usually it's just not that required. You may be wondering the difference between the plus and the minus and the exclamation point there. Basically, the exclamation point removes it altogether. The minus, you can remove a cipher from the list and then put it back in again later. And that way you can have an order of preferences. So if you have a need for very fine-grained control in the ciphers used on your system, you can do that. The URL there on the apache.org where you can go and research it further and in detail. Okay, the next one we have is HTTP trace and track. That's another really scary sounding one. We get a fair number of support requests on that. Really, it's just kind of a debug mode for web servers. It's not, it's a common in all web servers, but it's usually left there on by default. Again, the main problem there is it gives the attacker potentially more access than is required. You can turn this on when you need to do some debugging on your server, turn it back off again when you need to pass the PCI scan and maybe full time. And again, that's something you can affect through Apache configuration and WHM. Right there, trace enable, turn it off. Now this is probably a good time to observe. You'll see here in that part of the GUI, we have a few PCI recommended settings in there. So what this tells you can do is come into this part of the GUI, change all those to the PCI recommended, turn off indexes, hit save, boom. A whole class of PCI potential vulnerabilities is taken care of right there. Very easy. Well, that's not everything, unfortunately. There is some other stuff, but more we can do through the cPanel GUI. The next thing I ran into was Apache mod userdir enabled. You're probably familiar with that, where you put the host name, the slash, and tilde username. The problem with this, essentially, is that an attacker can test against a dictionary of names and get a list of valid names on the server. For example, that's half of a login and password. Once they have a valid username, they can start trying weak passwords and try to get access that way. So again, you're just giving them more information than is really required. This is also easily remedied through the Apache mod userdir tweak. That's just straight in WHM, and you'll see, just put a little check mark and enable it. And this basically protects the mod userdir from existing on the server. So again, that's taken care of, easy enough. So the next thing is something we're all familiar with, a self-signed SSL certificate for the host name. You can see right here it shows it's signed by cpliel.info, which is the easily rolls off the tongue domain name for my test machine. And of course it's self-signed. So you're all familiar with when you go to a website, a secure website, and you get that horrible warning message, hey, this is insecure. That's the problem. All you have to do is go buy a cert, go to WHM, install an SSL inside the domain, paste in the cert, it's taken care of. No problems. Now, one thing to point out here, if you're installing a cert for your host name and it's a shared IP, which it commonly is, you can still do it. You just need to enter the username nobody there in the GUI. And that just means it potentially can be the shared cert for that IP, which if you have mod user disabled doesn't help you a lot, but in any case, it will let you install the cert for the IP and get past that particular potential vulnerability. Now here's a more interesting one. OpenSSL multiple vulnerabilities, less than version 0.8.8.9e. 0.8.9e. Basically what it's saying is it's detected from the Apache banner on the server that you're running a version of OpenSSL that could potentially have exploits in it. And what they'll show you in the bug report is a list of CVE numbers, which are basically a security tracking number for different vulnerabilities. And if you click on those links there, it'll take you to a page which explains that particular vulnerability. Now, this is a little more interesting because on a CENT server or a cPanel server, we're generally controlling the versions of various different pieces of software you have. But it's okay because we've patched them. And this is how you can check. You do RPM -QA -- changelog, then a program name, and you can look at the changelog for that particular program. So here you can see, I'm doing that, I'm checking that on OpenSSL, and I'm grepping for one of the CVE numbers I was given. And you can see, hey, fix CVE 2009-1377 is in there and a couple others as well. And so that one's actually patched and it's okay. All right. And what I found on my server, at this date, around September 15th, 2010, was that all of them were patched except for one. There was one I didn't find a patch for in there. So I took a look at that CVE page, and I saw that it was still under review. They're still trying to figure out if it's a real bug or not. They're still trying to figure out if they're going to issue a patch for it. It's still under investigation, essentially. And so there's no patch available, and it may not even be an issue. So what you'll do is write a report. And in the McAfee scanner and the other scanners, they'll give you a place to report a false positive and explain yourself. And here you can see I've shown the RPM commands, I'm grep for the various CVE codes. I found them all, and the one I didn't find, I explain, hey, they don't have this patch in there, but it's not even really a bug yet. Follow your own link, take a look, you can see it's still a candidate, and it's not really an issue yet. You send that off in a day or two, they'll either come back to you with more questions, or they'll just take it out of your list of potential vulnerabilities, which is what happened here. I took care of it. But bear in mind, you can't just send this report to anybody. You have to look at your actual server, see what's on there, and make an appropriate report. And here you can see where you just paste that whole thing in there and send it off to them. It's a false positive. False positive. So, next we come to another very common one, which is unencrypted forms found. And you can see it's Mailman. Mailman has lots of unencrypted forms by default. It's probably worth mentioning this is something cPanel is aware of, and we're trying to find some more elegant solutions, but we do have ways of making this happen now. Basically, unencrypted forms with login information can be trivially sniffed by other users on the local network often. And so this is definitely not a good thing. You want all login forms to be encrypted whenever possible. And one way you can easily do that on a cPanel server today is just add a .htaccess file for it. And here you can see I've written down how you can do that. It's just under the cPanel install directory for Mailman, put an htaccess in there, it redirects all unencrypted connections to HTTPS, and that takes care of it right there. Okay, now the last major issue we found was an improper error handling. And you'll see here, that's a little arcane sounding, but basically it's a database error. Basically it's a script error. And if you go to the URL here, you'll see you have a broken script. We've all seen that. But you may have noticed, like here at the top, I blurred out the name of a database. You can see my home directory name, and thus probably my username. So again, you're giving out information to the world for no reason. This is why broken scripts are bad. Basically, a good script is not going to put out information like that, but there's a lot of bad scripts out there. They really should just put it out to a log file, give you an internal server error. There's a reason they have internal server error is so that nobody knows exactly what's going on. You have to log in the server and be the administrator to find out what's going on. So it's a very common problem, and it can also reveal the system resources that are used. Again, just giving an attacker more information to work with. So all broken scripts are potential security holes, and so they need to be fixed. That's all there is to it. There's no one way to fix a broken script. You have to look at that script, figure out what the problem is, fix it. If you can't fix it, remove it. Just take it out of there. It's the only way you're going to pass your scan. But it can't be spewing error messages to the world, right? Okay. Now at this point, we have good news. My server has passed the PCI security scan. Yay! But hey, what's going on here? I still have 36 level 1 problems. What does that mean? Well, basically, to pass the scan, at least in the McAfee scanner, you just have to deal with any level 3, 4, and 5 vulnerabilities, obviously being the worst. A lot of level 1 issues are just informational. I'm going to be showing you some of those. Some of them may actually be worth pursuing. So here, this first one, it says web server uses basic authentication. Well, that's odd. I thought we already dealt with that. Oh, it's port 2082, the cPanel port. Hey, what's going on? Well, fortunately, that is easy to deal with. You just go to WHM, tweak settings, and we have here the option to force only secure logins on the cPanel ports, and it's recommended. Basically, this is always good advice anyway. If your SSLs aren't working, then obviously you can't do the secure login, and so that's why the unsecure one's there. But really, you want to default to that whenever possible, and this will force it to happen. Now again, You can choose on this one. You can pass PCI compliance, but you will be more secure if you force the secure login. So that's your choice. But it's a good example of how the PCI compliance is not the full story on server security. Now we have one SMTP banner. You should disable this if you're not doing email on your server. Well, you probably are doing email on this server, so you leave it. Now, it's always going to turn up. It's letting you know that, hey, you're announcing that you do email on this server. Well, you kind of have to if you want to do email. Now, you can lock it down a little more, and that's a whole another subject. Again, that's just system administration. It's something you should definitely be thinking about. The more secure, the better, absolutely. But of course, you do have to let people actually use it. But it is a good idea to shut down any services you aren't actually using. Because if you're not using it, you're presenting some information to the outside world inevitably. You're allowing a way into your server, and if you're not intending anybody to use that service, well, it's just going to cause you problems, increase your load, and increase the security surface area is what they like to say. You know, the more things available for an attacker to talk to is more potential for your server to be compromised. So if you're not using a service, absolutely shut it down. Now we have one here, email IDs found. If you look here, you'll see it's some apache.org addresses, probably from the manual pages. Okay, that's good to know. Is it a problem? I don't know, is it your email address? You probably want to take it out of there. It's telling you where it found them. But really, it's not so much a security vulnerability per se as it is just information you may not have out there that you don't intend to have out there. So you gotta look at what it says, make a decision about how important that is to you, and then move on. Now, next one here is a bind hostname disclosure. You know, the bind banner is announcing your host name. People can find out what your host name is. And you see at the bottom, you know, it shows VPS. That's the name of my test machine. Well, you know, if I'm going to send mail from my server, I have to have a PTR record for the IP address anyway, which resolves to the host name. So is this a problem? Probably not. Not if you're doing email from the server. And again, it's a little bit arcane, but it's these little edge conditions that allow people to get unauthorized access to your system sometime. So again, good to know, not necessarily anything you need to be overly concerned about. Lastly, we have an interesting one, TCP timestamps. It's detected that this server uses TCP timestamps on the packets it sends out. What does this mean? Well, an attacker can determine how long your server's been up. Now that sounds really harmless, but there are some encryption-related attacks that have to do with knowing exactly how long the server's up. It has to do with generating random seeds and stuff like that. I don't understand it. It could also show if your server's been up for 5 years, well, there's a decent chance you don't have the latest kernel upgrade. That could be bad information as well. On the other hand, TCP timestamps can speed up things like encryption on your server. It's a performance issue as well. So again, something to be aware of, something you might potentially want to disable, but you just have to make a decision based on the particular needs of your server. So, in summary, cPanel does have many of the required settings needed to make your server PCI compliant in the GUI. You know, point and click, you can take care of them. Most of them are pretty straightforward, even if they appear arcane. Just carefully read what it's telling you. Go and look at what it's saying it looked at. It'll usually give you some way of doing that so you can see what it's talking about. And definitely feel free to contact cPanel. Put in a support request with us, you know, copy and paste what you're seeing in there, and we'll be glad to help you figure it out.